I'm here with Rich Devine, who has just had his book, Messy Social Work, published. And I wanted to talk to Rich about the book. So, Rich, can you just, how long have you been in social work and what's your role at the moment? Just give people a bit of a sense of who you are and what you do.
So I qualified in 2010, and
Mhm.
so I've been working as a social worker now for 15 years, and I
Mm.
spent the first 7 of those years working in a long-term child protection case holding team across 2 different local authorities, and then I transitioned into what's called like a parent and assessment social work role. So now I
Mm.
complete parent and assessments of children and families who are subject to a child protection plan or are subject to pre-proceedings or care proceedings. So
Okay.
at the sharper end of child protection. So that's predominantly where I've spent my time over the last 15 years.
Right. So 15 years in, what's kept you actually in the business end, the practice end of social work?
A couple of things. One was that I entered into social work to try and improve outcomes for children and families. And what I realized after maybe 4, 5, 6 years of working as a case holding social worker was that I became very good at implementing the processes, like the child protection processes, and explaining to parents what was going to happen should change not be brought about, and
Mm.
running care proceedings efficiently and effectively, and achieving certain outcomes for children and young people. But I still felt like I hadn't quite realised or found a way to fully support and help children to remain safely at home. And
Right.
so there was lots of there's lots of kind of ideological positions out there about um, children's rights and parents' rights, but actually the tension as a social worker is um, to be in between the two of those. And
Mm.
so
Mm.
so I'm definitely in favour of children remaining at home, but you want to
Mm.
be able to do that in a way that allows parents to do that safely, and therefore they're supported to bring about change. And then the second reason was that I just don't believe or haven't experienced um, the need to move through management in order to bring about change within the system. There's lots of things
Mm.
I've been able to do and been privileged to be a part of that has led to quite significant changes in the area I work in,
Mm.
even though I haven't moved or progressed into management or senior management.
Mm. Makes you unusual in social work. Um, when you talk, I hear Steve Edwards talking, who created the Signs of Safety with, because he was 17 years in child protection. He never wanted to go below above a senior practitioner. He didn't even want to be a team manager. He wanted to have his hands on practice all the time. That was it.
Yeah, and I think this is where I think social workers should think about the idea of leadership, not necessarily being determined by your job role or your position within a local authority. And I'm
Mm.
quite sure I would have learned this from you, that effective practice or driving forward change or bringing about change for families requires a degree of personal and professional leadership. And
Mm.
so you can have and develop those qualities irrespective of the role that you find yourself in.
Mm. Mm. I think, the fact that you've stayed in practice through 15 years makes you unique. What makes you even more unique is, to my knowledge, 38 years in this field, you're the only person who's been a practitioner that, while they're a practitioner, has written a book about their practice. I don't know anybody else who has actually done that. I know others that have, done it as a PhD after they've finished practice and so on. But what what was important for you about, and what was the motivation to want to write this book?
Well, what was important to me was around kind of centering the lived experience of myself as a practitioner.
Mm.
And I suppose when I came to write the book, I wanted to write about social work that was kind of clean and sanitized and had these brilliant, triumphant outcomes. But that just wasn't my experience.
Yeah.
And then I'd also read about social work that was quite critical of social work practice,
Mm.
but I felt like from outsiders and by people who were stripping away the context in which social workers found themselves in, or
Mm.
alternatively, it was represented in these kind of glossy, idealized kind of terms that I didn't recognise. So I wanted to write about social work from the perspective of a practitioner, including the highs and the lows and the triumphs and the tribulations, and in particular the kind of emotional experience of working with children and families who, if we're completely honest, have some of the most difficult or challenging or traumatized adverse experiences of people within our society. And so obviously that's going to bring up difficult and uncomfortable feelings for us as practitioners working within that space. Never mind the fact that you don't have to layer on top of that that we're a representative of a statutory organisation that brings a lot of fear and anxiety for parents that we work with, and that we're involved in some of the most I suppose, punitive or challenging decisions that one could be involved in as a professional, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I wanted to kind of put all of that into, but also provide a kind of guide or some ideas that I felt helped me along the way to be able to do work in a way that was kind of compassionate and prioritized prioritized the practice that was that gave parents dignity or respect or valued their kind of intrinsic humanity, I would say.
Yes. So you wanted to write a book, about clean social work, but you've ended up titling it Messy Social Work. When did that title come to you? When did you realize that's the title of what I'm writing?
Way after I'd actually written it. So I definitely wanted a book that captured the complexity, and that wasn't necessarily, I didn't want it to be like, oh, here's my manifesto about what social work is or should be, and I didn't want it to be a textbook either. I wanted it to be relatable and for social workers to be able to connect with it and to be able to learn. And so the title Messy Social Work came after a lot of deliberation and after many different titles towards the end.
So what does that title Messy Social Work mean to you?
It means so much, really, in terms of it encapsulates the complexity of the work that we do. It captures the moral distress involved in being involved in some of the decisions that we have to be involved in and working with some of the children and families. It also, I think, speaks to the moral imperative of the work, and I think that we need to be self-reflective and honest about our own limitations and our own shortcomings, both like individually, but also within the system. And to also just recognise that, we're not going to be able to achieve perfect outcomes. We're not going to be able to make children healthy and happy and safe, even though that's what many, social work organisations claim that we're there to do. And I think the best practice is uncertain and it's messy, and but despite all of that, we manage to establish a connection, and we bring about some safety, and hopefully we don't have to impose or involve statutory services.
Yes. You do something very interesting in this book, which for me is also unique. Is social work by definition is personal work, and it's intimate work, and going into intimate spaces in people's lives, and in child protection you're creating disruption and in fact have power over one of the most intimate relationships human beings can have, the parent to the child. But you start the book looking at your own journey to social work and your own your own background. Why was that important for you? Because it's always been a struggle in social work. I think we're so defensive about who we are as a profession. We're not psychologists, we're not psychiatrists. We're doing this uncertain work, but it's then we sort of big ourselves up like I'm the professional. But you start in a different place. You say, I'm Rich and this is my story and this is how I came to social work. What was important for you about that?
Yeah, I think partly like you say, because the work is so personal and intimate, that I think it's important, if not kind of morally and ethically necessary, that we examine our own motivations. And I think this is so. I think often social work gets framed in these very positive, idealized terms, and I think that's on the one hand, I think that's great, but there is also, I think there are often other motivations that might be related to our past experiences or some adversity that we've been through. And it isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I think a lot of the time it can be a positive thing, but we do have to bring that into dialogue or conversation with our practice. So yeah,
Yes.
I mean, my dad grew up in care and went to multiple different care homes and was abused in some of them, and spent most of his adulthood addicted to drugs and alcohol, and at times was violent towards my mum, and my mum suffered with mental health, and that led to the development of certain strategies that I needed to have in order to cope with some of those experiences. And it wasn't really until I was in a conference and a psychotherapist was talking about how a lot of social workers or a lot of people in the helping profession are often trying to rescue their former childhood selves. And it was at that point that I realized part of my motivation was so I became a social worker because my dad was also a social worker, but only for a short period of time, because he then gave up work and then relapsed into drugs and alcohol before he died when I was 16. So I felt like a need to continue what he wasn't able to finish. And so in a sense, I was trying to rescue my dad's childhood self, and my dad was also trying to rescue his kind of former childhood self. And there were lots of positives to that, in the sense of like I didn't necessarily judge people for using drugs or alcohol. I felt that was an understandable response to past adversity or psychological distress or whatever it might be. And so I could generate, or I could have intrinsic kind of empathy for people within those kind of predicaments, which then helped me develop and cultivate relationships with parents.
Yes.
But the downside was that sometimes I could over empathize with parents, perhaps at the risk of seeing how their behavior was affecting the child.
Yes.
So it's just about being aware of that and recognizing how it might influence our practice for the better, but also how it might compromise and affect our ability to judge and assess risk.
I mean, that was a really interesting phrase you used. Like our practice has to be in dialogue with our lived experience, our personal experience. I came into this field hugely influenced by second wave feminists, and they have the expression the personal is the political, and somewhere in my career I went, the personal is the professional is the political, and I think that's why I think even just how you've spoken is courageous, to speak openly about your own experience of coming into social work in your family, and that's not usual. And so we don't have that in dialogue, or we're sort of trying to be the professional. But there's a lot of talk about reflexivity, but that must, our judgments are set up by so much of our personal experience in life. And I think, what's the question I want to ask you? I think what's happened in social work, because we've been so furiously trying to stake a claim for ourselves as a profession, that the sort of personal's been erased. I remember one stage, I've done this exercise a number of times. The first time I did it, and it was in Australia, and I asked people to just write down their most, the proudest moment as a social worker, and also write down the most, despairing moment as a social worker. And it was really interesting because Aboriginal people, it's the first time that Aboriginal people had just led the way in talking, and you can imagine they were going to this, and this, and but there was one woman who she was known, like she was on the front line team, and she wasn't, she had this whole sensibility. I'll go into the worst case, family, and I protect children, and she'd go in with the cops, and she was giving me the big death stare. And then,
Mm,
and because when I say, what's the worst, and I think she didn't realize how loud she gave it. She was almost yelling at me, Andrew, Andrew, what you don't realize is we can't talk about how this work is affecting us,
mm,
and everybody just went silent, but you could see the distress for her. You're talking about the personal, and you want it in dialogue with our practice, and then you say it's messy social work, but that woman's experience is, I think there's been a lot of silencing in social work. We want to make it sound clean, and the proceduralization comes along, and it's all got to look green and polished, and here's your intervention plan, here's your assessment. And my experience is when we talk about real work as it's lived, it is messy, and there's a whole lot of silencing around it. So there must have been
mm,
times when you're writing, you're going, oh, can I write that? How will I write that? Because so much of good social work doesn't, I say, humanizes the protocols, the procedures. Or if you want to be more extreme about it, you'd say it steps outside or beyond. How was that as a writer of this book to navigate real social work and find words for that and words for your own experience in a system that's very proceduralized and wants it all, produced pretty clean?
Yeah, I think it definitely it took me time to find my voice. So I wouldn't have spoken openly about my experiences probably early on in my career.
Mm,
And that
mm,
was probably sensible because I couldn't differentiate whether
mm,
my reasons for disclosure or talking about it would be self-serving rather than to
mm,
support
mm,
or acknowledge someone else's position or distress. And then for me, because social work, I've never seen a kind of separation between my personal development and my professional development. They've been intrinsically
mhm,
linked with one another. So my capacity to be able to support another or to help another or to help them understand or go through change has always been intrinsically tied to my capacity to be able to offer that to myself.
mm,
And so there's often been like a parallel journey between me trying to figure out, well, what were my experiences and how did I learn to cope with those, and what effect did that have for me in
mm.
my relationships as an adult? If I'm expecting to apply that kind of scrutiny to parents, I
Yep.
need to at least, I think, subject myself to the same level of scrutiny.
Mm,
And that's where I think humility comes into play, because you realize that everybody finds ways of coping with what they've been through as
mm,
children and as adolescents, as young adults, and that's a strength of theirs. But sometimes those ways of coping get carried forward in ways that we're not always accounting for, or that might be having an influence on our life and our relationships, our
mm,
habits. It might result in some form of addiction. And so I just have always felt the need to unpick, examine, inquire into those if I'm going to have the ethical positioning in order to be able to do that with children and with families who I don't fundamentally see a difference between me and the parent that I'm working with, no matter how extreme or difficult the behaviour is. I
mhm,
see that the manifestation of certain behaviours, whether that be violence towards a partner, severe and significant drug addiction, um, significant mental health, I've experienced all versions of those, albeit maybe not to the same degree. So I
mm,
don't see like a categorical difference. I just see a difference in terms of how those symptoms manifest themselves. And I
mm,
think that's really important to break down the kind of separation between us and them,
mm,
and as a way of generating empathy,
mm.
which I think is a kind of precursor to supporting parents to look at some of those issues themselves.
I think in some ways you're talking about a very old-fashioned concept, that being compassion, which always
Mm.
surprises. Like it's almost become a taboo. Well, I think it is a taboo word in social work, that we having compassion for the people you're working with and having a sense of, you know, that could be me very easily.
Yeah, and I think, or we have compassion for people that we can easily relate to. but we don't have compassion for the father that sexually abuses their daughter, or the father who seriously assaults his partner, or the mother who seriously injures or kills their baby. And so there's a limit, or there's a threshold for which we're willing to apply that kind of compassion.
Yes.
And I think if you look at the deepest, darkest, ugliest aspects of yourself, you will see, I think, personally, this is what I see, not much of a separation between myself and those people that are doing these kind of horrendous acts and those horrendous behaviours. Now, none of that is to say that you excuse or you condone any of that behaviour. And I think sometimes this is what gets confused in child protection, is we think, oh, if we're compassionate towards the parent, we're then going to overlook some of the harm towards the child. And I think professional maturity, or sophisticated practice, or whatever you want to call it, requires that we hold on to both perspectives. That the parent is a victim and is offering suffering and can also be a perpetrator, and also the child is going through their own version of difficulties and whatnot.
Yes, yeah. And therein lies where you started of having this statutory role, but also trying to bring care. And you've got the parents and you've got the children, and you've got to work in those spaces. And that's part of the complexity. And you articulate it beautifully with compassion and reality, really, of the lived experience of the social worker. What, just by way of wrapping up, when you think about just let me ask, how long were you in the writing process for this book? How long did it take you to get it to point?
Well, I actually kept a diary from about 2 or 3 years into doing the job. And I think, and I can't quite remember, but I think I might have read Viktor Frankl's book. Viktor Frankl was a psychotherapist who was in Auschwitz. And I remember him describing that his way of surviving this experience was that he was going to come out and at some point he was going to tell the world. And so that he retained his sense of spirit and aliveness through this kind of vision and this ambition. And so I must have been inspired in some shape or form by reading that, because I then started keeping a journal. And I wouldn't necessarily write about the families. It was more about my emotional experience to having to work with some of these families and what it was bringing up for me. And I did that 10 minutes every other day, just when I was in the car, I had a bit of time. And I did that over 3 years. And then a few years later, after I'd been doing a lot of blogging and online writing, the publishers asked if I'd like to write a book. And then I obviously jumped at the opportunity. But then I remembered I had these journal entries. And when I pulled it all off into one document, it was like 30 pages. And so I was able to draw on that as a kind of resource and integrate those emotional experiences into my learning. And
So a very grounded example of reflective social work. And I think, what's extraordinary about you is you've taken the time to reflect on your practice in amongst all the busyness. And so in doing that and bringing this book to fruition and then getting it published, it's a big journey. What do you feel like is the biggest learning for you? Because I think the best books you write for yourself first.
The biggest learning, I think, has been, that's a really hard question.
Yes.
I think it's around how to translate what you're learning when you're doing the job into writing or into language that people can resonate, connect with, and then use in of themselves. And I think for me, one of the things I've learned, I suppose, is that there's so much of our job there's so much of the job which is about the nuts and bolts, what I would call the nuts and bolts of social work. Going to visit a parent, dealing with a degree of hostility, working with denial, writing an assessment, visiting children, the kind of bread and butter of social work that takes up 99% of social workers' time. And yet there's surprisingly little guidance or support that's rooted in practice, that brings together theory and in an integrative way that helps social workers with those kind of core tenets of the task. And I was struck when I read Harry Ferguson's book, which looks at social work across the last 100 or 150 years, how even though there's been significant changes in legislation and policy and service provision, the core tenets of social work, going out and seeing children, working with parents, trying to build a collaborative relationship, supporting them with change, have fundamentally remained unchanged.
Mm.
And so that was what I wanted to kind of focus on in writing the book.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. And for the social worker in practice, what do you most want them to get out of this book?
I want them mostly to have realistic expectations about what they're capable of achieving, so that they don't take on disproportionate responsibility that results in them feeling burnt out. And I want them to find a way to build meaningful, collaborative, and deeply compassionate relationships in a context where they're not always going to be facilitated to do that. And so I think social work is a real test of your character, because often you hear, parents just need us to be nice, and it's like, yeah, obviously people need us to be nice, but that's really difficult when you're being screamed at to get the fuck out of the house, or you're scared because you think the parent's intoxicated and they're presenting with a degree of hostility, or whatever might be happening within the situation. And so I think it's about how do you I want social workers to think about this idea of if you had a serious addiction or a serious issue with violence, or were living in social and economic deprivation, and you had a social worker knock on your door, and you were fearful, or you were scared, or you were angry, or you were avoidant, how would you want that person to show up to you, even though you had all of these kind of difficulties? And so that's what I hope I will encourage social workers to do and inspire them to do when they read the book.
Yep. I want to thank you for talking so eloquently about the work, and also for writing so eloquently and finding language for the lived experience of doing this work in child protection social work. And it's been a real pleasure to have you speak about the book.
And I want to thank you too, because you've been, you taught me a lot about how to build meaningful, collaborative relationships with social workers, and actually kept me in the profession at a point where I was becoming disillusioned and disenfranchised with the work that I was doing. So part of what sustained me is connecting and collaborating with people like yourself. And then the other thing was that, and this is, I suppose, what I wanted to come through the book as well, was that when I've seen you at conferences or at training, you have this kind of profound, almost kind of sacred respect for the frontline practitioner and what they're doing and what they're trying to achieve. And I really kind of admire that, because it's easy to be critical from the outside looking in. And I think you kind of connect with practitioners in a way that you want the practitioners to connect with children and families. And I think that's, in my experience, that's really rare. And so, I wanted to honour that too.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Rich. And thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about messy social work, real social work.